Hi everyone, welcome to We Are All Intellectuals. This event is part of the inaugural Sussex Festival of Ideas, a dynamic and engaging programme of talks, events and activities. This festival is being produced by the newly formed School of Media, Arts and Humanities at Sussex University. This event is being recorded and will be posted to the Sussex Festival of Ideas website after the festival. Live captioning is available and can be activated by pressing the live transcript button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. A member of the festival's team may contact attendees for feedback afterwards. If you do not wish to be contacted, please contact the festival team to opt out. You can do so by visiting the festival website. We welcome your questions via the Q&A panel, also found on the bottom right-hand corner, and we will respond to these at the end. And finally, just to note, this event will end promptly at 12:30. And now I'll hand over to the events chair, Professor Lucy Robinson.
Thanks, Emma. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm just going to explain what it is we're doing, and then I'm going to introduce our panel. So this is the first of a series of kind of occupations or interventions in the festival that's inspired and curated by Vivienne Westwood's Intellectuals Unite, the Subcultures Network and the Youth Club Museum. And for those of you who want to continue the discussion, I'm just going to share my screen and just show you a couple of places where you can continue the discussion with our collaborators. So Intellectuals Unite Book Club, which is kind of inspired by and organised around, mostly happens on my Instagram, that's Prof L Robinson, and all of the recordings of our previous book clubs are on there. And then if you want to know more about the Subcultures Network, then we are on Facebook, the snappily titled Subcultures, Popular Music and Social Change. So do come along and get involved in that if you're interested. Stop the share now. So we kind of take our inspiration from Vivienne Westwood's manifesto, Intellectuals Unite. And you know, you'll all be really aware of Westwood, who made a name associated with the first wave of punk, but the stuff that she's doing now, particularly around environmental activism and Intellectuals Unite, really isn't backwards looking nostalgia. Instead, she's really inviting us to recognise ourselves and each other as intellectuals in the broadest possible scope. You know, if you think, if you march, if you protest, if you look at art or read books, you are an intellectual. Over the last year, Vivienne's salon, Intellectuals Unite, moved into Instagram for a series of live book club events. And it was those conversations actually that really inspired the strand that we're running in the Sussex Festival Ideas. And we're also particularly interested in taking our conversations beyond the usual academic conversations. And I think universities have been pretty bad at noticing that people are perfectly capable of talking about big ideas, connecting to the past and to each other through their culture without a university in the room. So I wanted to kind of bring that conversation into this space, really. I think in the context of the current assault on arts and humanities funding across the board, I really wanted to put together a group of events and bring together groups of people inspired by literature and stories. So together today, we're going to share how books have helped us make sense of the present, connect with the past, and build a community of resilience by sharing stories about stories. I think there is something kind of profoundly punk rock about demanding access to the arts and humanities for all and recognising that literature gives us a sense of community and a sense of isolation, particularly communities built online around isolation, which I think might be something we'll touch on. So we're going to think about books that have spoken to us from the past, helped us thrive in the present and build new communities for a better future, I guess. We're going to ask you to contribute through the Q&A. So I've got two things that I'm particularly interested in thinking about. One is, we talk about books connecting us with each other, but have books ever really disconnected you with anyone? So is there a book that the fact that someone loves it has really put you off them forever? Have you ever dumped someone because of the literature that they read? And also, how can we change the world with books? So is there a book that you think if more people read it, the world would be a better place, or we could start a revolution? All right, so now I'm going to introduce our panel. So we've got someone who was with IOU Book Club from the beginning, we've got someone who joined in from the end, and we've got a new recruit. So someone who joined in towards the end of the run is Jemima Jury, who is a writer, editor, curator, and archivist. She's a patron of the Grey Theatre Company and an active volunteer and director for a number of mutual aid and social enterprise groups. She lives in Hastings, England, with her partner and 3 children, and is currently working on her first novel. In 2012, Jemima edited Hello Sausages, The Lyrics of Ian Dury, which was published by Bloomsbury, which is a book of her father's lyrics. And she also wrote a short story about their relationship for My Old Man, Tales of Our Fathers, which was edited by Tess Kessler for Canongate in 2016. And then someone who was there from the very beginning, one of the first people I co-opted into IOU Book Club Online when we moved a book club into Instagram, is Pam Thirschwell. She's reader in English and head of the English literature department here at Sussex. And she's written 2 books, Literature, Technology and Magical Thinking, which is published with Cambridge Press from Cambridge Press in 2001, and Sigmund Freud, and several others, including Quadrophenia and Modern Culture. She's also published on David Bowie, George Eliot, Taylor Swift, Billy Bragg, Joni Mitchell, Margaret Atwood, and repeatedly Henry James. And she's currently writing a book called Destructive Characters, which is about adolescence and time in the 20th and 21st century. And then finally, our new recruit, Zoe Daniels. Zoe is a campaigner, educator and content creator, and she's the vice chair of All-in-One Education, an intersectional grassroots educational charity. She's co-founder of Collective LDN, a collective rooted in abolition. And Zoe is originally from Sweden, but has lived in the UK for over 15 years and currently also lives in Hastings. Zoe has been involved with a number of political campaigns, most recently Kill the Pill and Teach the Truth. She's also a writer, and her most recently published articles on Spark & Co. and Storytime. So I'm going to just play you a very, very brief kind of holding welcome message from Vivienne.
Okay. Hello, Intellectuals Unite. I'm exhausted. I appreciate so much what Lucy's doing. I'm going to do another session and tell you everything I want you to know. So please come along when I get round to inviting you soon. Bye.
Were you able to see that, or maybe just hear it? Okay, so let's start off with our discussion. I thought we'd start with ourselves, and maybe we could take it in turns to just share some connection that you found with literature over the last year. Now, what is there? What books have you connected with? What stories have re-inspired you? Something that kind of has touched you this year. Jemima, shall I start with you?
Yeah, okay. Well, I've been led down a few paths because of my own writing, actually, and I'm writing a novel which is based on a fictionalized Hastings. So I've got to know local area really well and connected. I feel like I've really connected with local people by looking into what issues there are here. My research took me off down a historical path, and I became aware of 2 local people, Marion North and Archie Blaney, otherwise known as Grey Owl, who was a sort of reinvented man, changed his persona to that of a Native American and then moved to Canada. That's a very long story. But the research was mostly centered around a young woman, 19, care leaver. And all the research I've done about her and social care has made me feel very connected and very caring about who's around. And then that actually became 2 books. I've got the present and then the past. The crazy characters of the past will become a sort of an accompaniment later on. So yes, connections to do with local area, and then reading around that, anything to do with strong young characters like To Kill a Mockingbird and Scout, books that really sort of anchored through a young person's eyes.
That's brilliant, Joanna. Thank you. And I think thinking about generation is something that we might come up with later, because I think that's really important. And the books that we carry with us from our childhood make our long-term companions, aren't they? So what kind of literature have you been connected with over the last year that has been helping you get through the last year?
Me?
Yes.
I've been reading a lot of literature by Black authors. So I committed to sort of kind of playing catch up with it for an entire year, as I felt that had been denied to me within the British education system. And one of the books that really resonated with me was Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. And it introduced me to Black British life in London. It connected me to that culture because I've never had that myself. I grew up in very white areas. I grew up in Sweden, and then I grew up in Hastings. And Hastings used to be, I don't know what the census is now, but it used to be 97.9% white. And even living in London, I wasn't, because I hadn't grown up there, it was a whole different journey of trying to connect to all these different cultures, because it is very different from Black children who grow up rurally. But this book gave me that sort of segue, and then I found all these similarities with me and the character, and it even helped me deal with my anxiety. So it's just like I would honestly recommend it to anyone. And then sort of another book that's really kind of connected me to my political side of my sort of personality was The Freedom Artist by Ben Okri. And that sort of just it helped me question everything, which is also kind of stressful, but it was a good thing, because it helped me like critically approach the world the way we see it, and approach these things that we you might not think that abolition is possible of prisons, police and borders, but reading this book when everything seems hopeless, you find the possibility within that there's endless possibilities within that. So yeah, that's kind of been my journey over the past year within lockdown, reading abolitionist literature, but also novels by Black authors about Black characters.
I think that idea of playing catch up sits really interestingly with Jemima's point about books from our childhood, actually, and that we have to kind of do some retrospective justice there. Pam, is there anything that comes to mind when you think about the last year? And
I mean, there's lots, but I think the one I wanted to talk about most was Ling Ma's novel Severance from 2018. She's an American author. And this novel predates the pandemic, but it's so relevant to it. It's about a young Chinese American woman, Candice Chen. She lives in New York City, and she works for a publishing company that imports Bibles from China. So it's about globalization, capitalism. But the world in this novel is hit by a disease which appears to have originated from the Shenzhou region in China. So it's known as Shen fever, and it turns people into brainless zombies who can do nothing but kind of adhere mindlessly to their everyday routines until they drop dead. So it's a zombie novel, but it's a pandemic novel, and it's a millennial novel. And it's about working yourself to death as well. That's one of the things that happens. So Candice, the heroine, is immune to it. And it's sort of about her escaping. And it's very funny. There's all this stuff that happens in shopping malls. It's about her nostalgia for the 80s and her relationship with the immigrant identity as well. But it was amazing that it was written before the pandemic. It includes scenes of people it has questions about what it means to wear a mask. Like, are you just trying to show to other people that you're wearing a mask, or are you actually, because in the novel, people know the masks don't really help, that it spreads too. So I taught it in my I read it like in March, was completely blown away by it, and taught it to my contemporary literature students this year, which was great. And I was afraid students would be like, I can't believe you're making us read a novel about a pandemic apocalypse, but people seem to really love it. So, and it inspired, one of the great things it inspired for me was one of my students said, this is kind of like this Phoebe Bridgers song, I Know the End, which is an amazing song. And it's like a little short story about an apocalypse. So it just felt like it's been one of the really nice things, is feeling that back and forth, and how novels can predict what we might need to know right now.
Absolutely. I mean, those together, those are three just great ways of thinking about how literature helps us in terms of the process of producing it, but also connecting to the past and making sense of the present, and that we redeploy books at different parts of our lives, I think. And I think one of the things that has been almost a compulsory focus is around resilience, and whether that's resilience in order to be a productive worker or resilience in order to, you know, look after our mental health, as Zoe's suggesting. And there's a particular organisation, Jemima, that I thought I might ask you just to touch on, in case students were in the Hastings zone, about the Egtooth project and the very specific relationship there between kind of literature and other sorts of creativity and mental health well-being.
Yes, the Egtooth project is a really interesting organisation, because I'm hoping that it's reflective of something that's happening nationally, as we are facing a kind of tsunami of mental health problems amongst young people. And Egtooth was set up a couple of years ago. I learnt about it partly because it's very local to me, but also I contributed to the fundraiser when they were looking for premises. So, and a few friends of mine are practitioners with Egtooth, so I'm quite familiar with what they do. And it's very, very necessary. So it's supporting children, young people and families to explore ways to cope. And it's very much based around what that person's engagement with their environment, their society, their family situation might be. So it's not like prescribed counselling. There's nothing being placed on those people to sort of follow, if you like. They're being asked to engage with what they choose to engage with. So there are lots of practitioners across all the creative industries, writers, forest school people, artists, but there are talking therapies as well. There's a lot of one-to-one support if you need it. And what's interesting is that writing, spoken word, music, that's being brought in as a way for people to express themselves. And I think it's probably what we all think of as connecting back to various youth movements, youth cultures, punk movement, grime, rap, whatever your chosen or your era's youth culture was. I think it's very important that there's resilience being encouraged through expression. So I know Laura, who is one of the co-founders and directors of Egtooth, is she's very keen to see tenacity, empathy, compassion leading the way. And it's very much a female-led organisation, not entirely, but largely, which she feels is about not waiting for politics to change, taking control, leading with those wonderful things that I mentioned a minute ago to try and engage people in their surroundings. And that's what we've all got to do. I think it's about a taking control, sort of fight back situation, I think.
Well, it's a really lovely example of something that I know we're going to talk about in a moment, actually, which is, you know, sometimes what do you do when there isn't a culture out there that speaks to you, when you don't have access to the stories that are going to help you connect to the world around you. And maybe one of the amazing things that Egtooth does is that it actually says, okay, so let's work with you to write the stories that you need. Let's work with you to see the culture that you need. Okay, so we're going to think a little bit more sort of collectively, and thinking a bit more about kind of what it means, really, I suppose, to the fact that we're now telling stories in so many different places. So we're thinking, so we put big fat European novels onto Instagram, and people are using Zoom that was designed for, multinational business companies to hold, parties with their families. So we're I think there's something quite punk rock about that, really. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the relationship between the digital and physical spaces for sharing stories. And I suppose, so I'm thinking about your app here, really, and the way in which the app that you've been working with is connecting real places with digital mapping. And I wonder if you just want to talk that through for a little bit for people.
Yeah, of course. So basically, I'm the co-founder of Collective Action LDN, and recently with the Kill the Bill campaign, we sort of noticed that there was a gap in terms of showing where all the protests were, showing people that these were accessible to come to, that they would be in your area, because it was happening all over the UK, including Ireland. And what we did was we used an existing app and just mapped all the protests on it across the UK. So it's interactive, it's live, it's constantly getting changed and updated. And that was our way of connecting to the campaign and connecting to people so that they understood that these things were happening in their communities and these things were accessible.
I mean, that idea of kind of make, do and mend is really punk rock, isn't it? It's like, okay, what have you got and what can I do with it? And I think particularly there's something about, you know, where people, when with a sense of digital isolation, being able to facilitate a social protest by using an app like that, I think it's a really interesting twist on that. Okay, so we're going to think about how we can make the world a better place. Right. And I suppose one of the things, and that builds out of what you've just been saying, really, Zoe, about Black Lives Matter as an educational process in some ways, you know, that Black Lives Matter has been about reteaching new histories, and it's definitely about being, you know, not just swapping out what's in the canon, but challenging the idea of a canon. And I thought one of the things we could just think about is just that idea of decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing literature. We're already thinking about, it's not just about writing, reading and sharing. So I think when we're thinking about decolonizing, we're thinking about changing who's writing, changing what we're reading, and maybe changing how we share it. And I thought that just seems really important for us to think about, I guess. So right now, how do we think that process of decolonizing what constitutes literature, whether that's about who's writing it, what's being written about, or where things are being read, where we are in that process right now. So I think maybe your starting point about, okay, so let's do some justice and catch up here would be a really useful place to start. And then Pam, maybe I could ask you to talk about what's happening in the curriculum here at Sussex a little bit. And then Joanne, I thought we might think about actually spaces and statues and who are we celebrating anyway. So do you want to talk me through a little bit of the stuff that either comes out of your only reading Black authors, or the other stuff around the decolonizing project?
Yeah, so I mean, out of just reading from Black authors, it needs to go beyond that. That's just the first step. So it's finding independent publishers that are run by Black people, for example, or racialized people who are closer, who have a better understanding of where we're coming from, aren't as represented within the publishing industry. It's a whole line of things. It starts with the author, it goes to the publisher, it goes to where it's being read. It's even down to the language that's being used within those books. Because just because someone's a Black author doesn't mean that they might be using the sort of language that was taught to them, which is colonized language. And it's thinking about, within my work, for example, there's certain words that I've stopped using because it needs to develop, and when I realize that it's got that connection to coloniality, I kind of just abolish that from my vocabulary. So something like I don't use slave, I say enslaved instead. Just thinking about the fact that being a slave, it's not someone's whole identity, and understanding that person was kidnapped, they were stolen, understanding that history, because when we just use slave, we erase all of that, and we do ourselves a disservice as well as everyone else. And I think, the process is just thinking about every single factor that connects to colonialism and dismantling that. Frantz Fanon said that it's decolonization is a violent process. And I think that it is because you're disrupting the status quo. We might not see it as, we might not be seeing that now, but it is happening under the surface, and you can see the status quo reacting to us wanting to read more Black British history, for example, with trying to ban critical race theory in certain places. I think there was a conversation about intersectionality being bad in America, and this whole thing, which also shows that there's a complete lack of understanding of what those words mean. But I think where we're at is we're still brewing. It's still the beginning, and we still need to, it's a whole process it's ongoing, and it's going to take decades and decades and decades. That job is never done because it's been embedded into the fabric of our society.
I mean, I think that the ongoingness of that as a process is really important, isn't it? I mean, the kind of complacency around the idea that it could somehow be a completed project, you know. And I think also what you're saying really speaks to kind of the approach to literature that we've been working through in IOE, which is understanding that books come from somewhere, right? They're a product of their moment. They are an object. They are a form. They have narratives, and they do stuff to the world. The meaning is accrued through all of that process. So I guess almost at the other end of that process is, okay, so then what does that mean when we're at the teaching end, where we're working in universities? So how do we think about that, Pam?
There's a couple of things. I mean, there's a number of things I could say, but I wanted to sort of say, to sort of taking off from what Zoe was saying. I mean, you do know that if people like in America and here, you know, you're seeing it all on Twitter. If people are afraid of critical race theory, that's good, right? Like I was just thinking about what you're saying. You know, it matters. It is something. They're not like saying this is just happening in academic circles and no one's going to pay attention to it anyway. They're worried, and that I think is just really, really good. And I was really interested in what you were saying about using enslaved people instead of slaves. And there's all these big questions about language that can get really difficult because we are the product of the language that made us and of the things we read and the things we took in. And that's part of what I think the Intellectuals Unite is about, is thinking through that too. But I'll just say from my perspective, what I've done recently is taking part in this decolonizing the curriculum, but also I wanted to bring in the word co-production as well, where you're talking to students together. We worked with these amazing seminars a couple of years ago to help shape, for me, a number of other great people involved. Sam Solomon was there, Khadija Hussein, and lots of other students who were fabulous and who had taken the first year course came to this, talked to me about how to redo it, what to think about it. And it was just incredibly enlightening for me. And it was a chance to think together with students about how we can make the course not just more diverse, but more generally challenging to the stories which are frequently told about the history of poetry or the novel, which is what this class was on. And these stories usually often boil down to, there was this one genius white guy who read classical literature in the Bible and wrote this brilliant poem, and then another genius white guy read that poem, and you can see the line moving. So how do you dismantle or change that story? And it's a hard one to do in some ways, but it's really important, and we, you know, kind of are still working at it and trying to dig deep down into decolonizing, so that it's not at Sussex about, on the surface, quick, get some extra authors in. Really think about how the whole story fits together.
Thanks, Pam. And Jemima, have you got any thoughts about kind of how do we change the stories? How do we change who ends up being celebrated? How do we do more than just, you know, swap in a couple of kind of different authors or different statues? Have you got any thoughts around that, Billy?
I think it's really important what Zoe said about publishing. I think that definitely is a big area that needs to be tackled, because it's shockingly small. People from diverse backgrounds getting published is like a few percent, you know, compared to the whole of the publishing industry. So that's definitely one area. I think some people, and it's sort of, the whole argument is a two-pronged approach, I think. We need to address the past, and we need to go forging ahead in the future with lots of differences. And I think that the statue issue is a good example. In Kilvin Grove Park in Glasgow last year, the park responded they perhaps couldn't go as far as they should have done, but they responded in a really good way, I thought, to the BLM action that was being taken over certain statues. And the statue they've got in Kilvin Grove is of Lord Roberts, who fought in the Boer War and basically put Boers into concentration camps, but also created concentration camps for Black Africans who were then treated far, far worse. It was shocking. And very rightly so, the park addressed that situation, knowing that there might be some vandalism. They put notices up all around that statue explaining, giving it historical context. And I thought that was a very good way to tackle it in the immediate. And then obviously in the future, we cannot be putting statues up without a lot of sensitivity, if that's the issue. But it goes for all memorials. It's, you know, some universities, in some academic circles, I think Glasgow University has been very good at this, is really tackling and addressing its past. You know, we've got these institutions built on all sorts of wrongs in the past. We've got to meet it head on. We've got to talk about it. You've got to contextualize it and not repeat. So it's sort of addressing the past, forging ahead in the future. And I think part of that, it goes for race issues, it goes for gender, it goes for disability. There are so many different areas in society that we need to change language. Language is so key. And that example that Zoe has given, slave, enslaved, it seems really subtle, but it's huge. It's a really profoundly different meaning. And the same goes in those other areas as well. So it's somehow addressing the link in between. We can talk about this in academic, intellectual, certain circles. How do we filter that down? And I think, again, we go back to art, literature, music. People are going to address it, and they're going to do it through the things that reach everybody in a very accessible way. And I think that's probably how we really we put it out there that needs to happen, I think.
Yeah, and I think the point is to listen, isn't it? I mean, quite often the standard response, which is, it's making me awkward, I'm going to say something and fill the space with my awkwardness, is to say, well, how am I supposed to know? It's like, you just listen, we're telling you. I mean, there's a big discussion, as a disabled person, there's a big discussion with non-disabled people telling me that I should call myself a person with a disability rather than, whereas I call myself a disabled person, right? And so, and that's, you can have that conversation. It's a really important conversation. It's not a pedantic linguistic issue. It's about the individual and society. Brilliant. So we're going to move on to the second thing, which we always think about in IOU Book Club, which is the Taylor Swift question. So the Taylor Swift question has two parts. One is Taylor Swift will be criticised for only writing about herself in a way that a man would never be criticised or wouldn't be criticised for writing about. Men have produced albums about their failed relationships, for example. So that's the first part, is kind of why women get judged as producers differently. Why is that? What can we do about that? And then the second is really also inspired with a kind of, if girls like it, it must be shit, is the kind of assumption, right? So and what those value judgments are really. And one of the things that I often think about is something that Helen McCookery-Book, who's a punk musician producer, said, which at a talk I went to once, which is, listen, if girls didn't get into music that had bad images of girls in it, they'd never have any music to listen to, right? So we have to work quite hard to deal with representations that are not comfortable for us, or we have to work quite hard to find connections in literature that really wasn't written for us. So one of the things I often talk about is when I really couldn't understand T.S. Eliot as a single mum at university, and my amazing English lit tutor at Oxford Poly just went, Lucy, he wasn't writing it for you, that's the point, right? Yeah, I didn't know Latin, I don't know my ancient Greek stuff. So I thought we could just think about those kind of two questions really. One is around the different sorts of judgment around gender and the value of literature, and that might be around children's books, or it might be around different sorts of popular culture. And then the other thing is, like, what do we do with the books that aren't written for us? So I don't know, who wants to have a go at the Taylor Swift question?
I'm always up for the Taylor Swift question, but I've heard myself talk about this, and others might have more. Please interrupt me, guys, please. I mean, it's really interesting. For me, it's kind of the Taylor Swift and Sylvia Plath question, really, because she's another person who is often talked about by critics, usually older white male critics, as if everything she does is entirely autobiographical, as if she's just opening up her veins and bleeding onto the page, not constructing unbelievably well-constructed songs in the case of Taylor, or poems for Sylvia, whereas like someone like Philip Roth writes novels which are largely about his sexual hang-ups, but people see them as about America, right? Or as about, and it's like, who gets to be the generic subject? Who is the world constructed around? Who's at the center of it, and who has a very specific subjective point of view? It's just Taylor complaining about her exes, but jump in, Jemima.
Pam, I'm interested to know what you think from a literary point of view. Do you think it's because traditionally we're obsessed with the male hero, the monomyth, the hero culture that is in going back to the ancient Greeks, that the Odysseys, the great adventures center around males, and we can't really get away from that at the center of it all?
Yeah, I definitely think that's part of the issue, is about a culture which has grown up like sort of, just admiring the rugged individual, the person who does it alone. In terms of the novel, this goes back to like Robinson Crusoe, right? He's left on an island and he's going to build the world. He's going to enslave somebody. He's going to, he's going to create civilization, which is about him doing his thing, being the hero. And I think you can see those archetypes going way back, and they're based on masculine things. So everybody else's story doesn't count as the story, or, I totally, but I don't know if other people come.
And that's how we end up with the statues problem, right?
Right.
That's how we end up with the bad white guys on plinths, I think. So
I think like our entire world is constructed to uphold white male supremacy. So like all the language that we use within this world is geared to favor men. It's like that's also embedded within the fabric of our society. And so when you get someone like Taylor Swift singing, all the words that are associated with women, it's always negative. When we express our emotions, we're hysterical. Nothing is tangible about us. It's just we've always got this sort of negative language used around who we are as people. It's been constructed that way. It's a social hierarchy. So I think that when it comes to literature, when it comes to criticizing literature and looking at male and female writers, and looking at their stories, they will always currently favor men, and that is being challenged. We're seeing it more and more, I think, because it comes down to publishing, it comes down to opportunities, it comes down to, so again, we're trying to decolonize that industry so that we are seen as who we are, the people that we are, and also by deconstructing gender. Full stop. We would eliminate this problem but do you know what I mean? Because there's a binary that's been created to instill that social hierarchy. But once we eliminate gender, because it really isn't as binary as we've been told it is, then we will start moving forward and face less criticism as women or just as people.
Jemima, have you got any thoughts about the status of the male of the individual male artist?
Oh yes. I think again it comes down to access and tradition, and if in our more recent history, I'm sure, and I wish I could think of them now, there are lots of examples of cultures, and going back into prehistory when this really wasn't the case, but it's been so patriarchal for hundreds of years that we're used to hearing male voices and we kind of accept that. But that's also about access and practicality. So thinking of a room of one's own and needing space, needing the time to write, to read, to do music, whatever that, to paint, to create and to reflect on, or even just to philosophize and think. You need space, you need access to that space, and women may not have been afforded that very much, I don't think, for quite some time, but that is changing. We are much more fluid about how we work now. We're much more chop and change with the sort of whole workplace system. So I do think that's changing, but perhaps not enough because it's embedded. But yeah, and particularly in music, very dominated by the central male rock and roller. Can't completely condemn that. That's, influenced my life very, very much. But I think it's, particularly in the 70s, when I was growing up as a young child, that was very dominating. And some, particularly in punk, the Viv Albertines and the Polystyrenes had to fight pretty hard to have their place there. And it cannot have been easy. It was pretty spectacular, but it can't have been easy to be accepted. But they obviously did a very, very brilliant job.
Well, I think that really holds true, I think, in terms of the female novelists who did the novel comes out in a really particular moment in time, which is really, that sort of industrialization and what that does to the family unit and all of that stuff. But I'm always aware that when I'm celebrating those female novelists who did break through, whether they used a female name to publish or not, that I have to be really aware that I cannot then say this is a universal general experience, right? Because these are the exceptional, and so it's kind of, it has to be a constant dialectic between these women, women experience marginalisation and they stood up and did something about it, and they experienced marginalisation thing. There's a couple more things I just want to pick up on before we open it up to any Q&A. So if anyone's got any thoughts or questions, do put them into the Q&A and we'll have a look at those. Is what do we do about the books that really weren't written for us? And to what extent are we prepared to put the effort in to find ourselves in those books? Or, or actually is Zoe's approach, which is like, you've had enough of my time and my reading space, I'm gonna something else, thank you very much. I'm really aware during book club that often the only women that you could connect with were where they were kind of interesting characters. They were often governesses or people moving through in liminal spaces, which made them interesting. And we shifted it by going, that's where we're going to put our focus. We're going to put our focus in the liminal people who are just moving through. But on the process, there's a lot of patriarchy, got a lot of attention on that journey, I suppose. So I just guess if you have any thoughts about, are there books that were not meant for you and you enjoy them anyway? Or is there a pleasure in appropriating a novel for yourself that wasn't meant for you? I just wondered who's got any thoughts about that? So
so I read Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire in school, because obviously that's a play, but we had to read it out loud, and I loved it because I love a Texan accent. I just love the culture for some reason, even though it's like a red state. And one of the things within the book is one of the characters, or the Black characters, their names, they don't have a name. The names are the Negro woman. And whenever it would come round to me, I'd be Blanche Dubois in the book, but I would also read the Negro woman. And I would just think this book really wasn't written for me, but I loved the way it was written. I would have preferred that she had a name, but it was the only book that I had within college that was cosmopolitan. So it was the only one that had a Black character of any sort. And yes, she was nameless, but it resonated with me in a way because I felt like I was nameless within that environment. I wasn't represented within the curriculum. There weren't any other Black students in my class. So it kind of resonated with me because of that. And I looked at it still critically. So even though it was like a place of escapism, it was also kind of looking at it critically, being like, well, she doesn't have these characteristics. She should have these characteristics. It's not a truly cosmopolitan book, even though they're trying to teach it as a cosmopolitan book. And I think that was sort of my first journey into realizing that maybe my teachers didn't know everything. But yeah, that's one of the books where I knew it wasn't written for me, but it still kind of resonated with me.
I think I had really similar feelings reading Brighton Rock, actually, for the book, which I really love. But the racial representation really is, it's exactly the thing, that representation is not always a good thing, right? It's about what's the purpose of that representation. Mine or Pam, have you got any thoughts about, books that you've wormed your way into enjoying?
Mine is, a lot of it's coming from another direction on it, which is, and this is partly a plug for why critical reading is so important, to be able to go back to things you love and sometimes reject them totally. Like when I was 12, this confessional moment, I read Gone with the Wind and was totally engrossed with it for 3 days. I read this novel, came back to it a few years later, like going, oh my God, the Ku Klux Klan, what the hell was I thinking? And that's, for me, is what doing an English literature degree, doing a humanities degree is about. But it's also because I'm also a Freudian, I like psychoanalysis. I like the idea that we all have these mixed feelings, ambivalent, we have to recognize what we love. And on some level that will involve rejecting it, but it's also about recognizing what that did to us and how that made us who we are. So I have tons of, most books I came to, I felt totally shut out by T.S. Eliot, by the Latin and the Greek. And now I teach it and give lectures on it. And I say, that's how he wants you to feel. So what can we say about it? What was he trying to do? What does this mean about modernism? There's lots of different ways into these every text is problematic in some way. This is not an all lives matter, but every text is problematic because all people are problematic, which is why we also shouldn't have heroes, right? There's some version of that that I feel like this is an incredibly important question to keep coming back to.
And I think it's a question, maybe Jemima, you might want to pick up on it, about kind of what do we do once it's undeniable how problematic some of those authors or musicians are. I remember I was a really big Philip Larkin fan for I don't know why, so just my dad probably but there was a really interesting move in the late 80s, I think, to get him taken out of reading, taken off kind of reading list when it was very clear what kind of misogynist he'd been, which was probably like the first time I was aware actually that maybe there are things that are too bad to do to still get away with it. And I wanted to know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yes, I think sometimes you can't just contextualize something. I think you do have to remove, actually. I think you have to take something away in order not to subject somebody to a particular idea or thought, because it can be damaging or it can be totally insensitive. I can't think of too many really extreme examples, but going back to what you're saying about difficult books not written for us, I struggle with Steppenwolf, interestingly, which is our next book club book, because I can't understand why they're all so navel gazing and so agonized about the things they're agonized about. But I learn a huge amount from reading that book. It's really interesting, and I can't totally identify with the psyche of those male characters, the sort of book within a book aspect of it, and the constant references to dark things like suicide and those issues. However, Herman Hesse has done something very, very clever with it. Therefore, it's very rewarding once you battle through the sort of agony of reading it almost. It's incredible. And sometimes you've got to carry on. And I do abandon books all the time because I just can't click. I tried to read an Alice Munro short stories book last year. Couldn't do it at all. I just couldn't connect. But I will probably go back to that because it feels like something unaddressed. And sometimes that takes time and effort. Not everyone's got that, and it's not for everybody as well, that challenge, because it can be, can't it, with some authors. But
and also I was just wondering, does it bring up also a question about like when you read things, or when the problem with schools is like giving kids the same books over and over again is they're not seeing that it's only a tiny part of the story. Whereas when we're older and we're doing a book club, or when we're, it's like it's partly about time. Like, how do you teach everything? And one good answer, it was what Zoe said before, is like, okay, we've had plenty of time with these white authors. Now we've got to make the time for all the stories that were excluded. There's so many complicated questions about it, though.
And I think Jerome's point is so important, isn't it? That our need for a book to be read does not outweigh the need for someone not to see that book, right? And that kind of balancing act is really, really important, isn't it? And I think particularly, historians of childhood could explain to us a bit more about how, what we understand as English literature is in itself a colonial project. It's around, it was around colonizing India and being able to sell the civil, and pass certain qualifications to be working in the civil service. What books get on to the national curriculum is an extremely political issue. The reason why, there's a reason why Lord of the Flies was really popular. It's because they wanted boys to read, because they were really worried that it's girls. There's always been that anxiety around kind of male engagement with literature, which is really interesting in terms of the gender of authors versus the gender of readership, I guess. And I think kind of where being prepared to let someone else draw that line, I think is really important, actually, thinking about what Jemima's saying, that, there may well be something that is too far for someone else, and that's okay. That's going to trump my desire to talk about that book every single time, I guess. Which I think leads us to our kind of final bit of discussion, which is really to think about, in the broader context of arts and humanities being under attack, not just in universities, but in terms of it being associated with a sort of liberalism that is seen as dangerous, or or that critical thinking generally in the world is seen as a bad thing, or in the wake of populism. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about why are people so scared of arts and humanities, literature, stories? Like, what can we do with that? You know, can we start, we've got 10 minutes, can we start a revolution using books in the next 10 minutes? So, yeah, I think we probably can. So why are we such a problem? And what can we do with that, I guess? Who wants to have a go on that one? Zoe.
Well, education within itself challenges the world around. It challenges us to think beyond what we see in front of us. And in every single movement, that has been the biggest. Literature has been one of the biggest threats to that. The Black consciousness movement of the 1960s, combined with the civil rights movement, that they were so terrified that people would know about their history through literature. The Black Panthers used to distribute magazines, and that was what was inspiring the youth to stand up and fight the system. And I think that even now you see that they're terrified of that as well, because film, books, podcasts, all of these things allow us to walk in someone else's shoes. It breaks down barriers, it builds empathy. It's all of these elements that they would rather have us not do, because those things challenge the status quo. And you can absolutely start a revolution just through literature. I mean, even during World War II, you had, I think there were a group of anti-fascists who were handing out zines. And that was like a huge threat. And in the end, I'm so annoyed that I can't remember her name, but in the end, she was killed by the Nazis, because it was such a huge threat, that literature that she was sending out. And we see now, actually, on the other hand, the far right using those same systems now sort of against us. So there's this battle, but the left have always been sort of underground, and we've found different ways to convey our information, whether it's through graffiti or, more sort of punk messages, like through music as well. Whereas the far right, they need to dominate the status quo. They need to have their own GMB news channels and things like that in order to get their news across. But I think, absolutely, it's the most powerful tool at our disposal to change the world.
I'm really struck. I was thinking, as you're speaking about the importance of prison education and the cuts in prison education, and the Open University has an incredibly political role, and particularly around the IRA and Republican education. They were kind of in and prisoners' home universities within prisons, but also the Open University is still doing amazing work. Really kind of political education in prisons. And it's harder and harder and harder in the current context. So any other thoughts around kind of why they hate us and how we can start a revolution?
Well, it's a huge discussion topic. I mean, can you, like that great line from W.H. Auden where he says, poetry makes nothing happen. And it's like, we need to, we needed to recognize that writing a poem is not going to cause a revolution. And we also I think we need to recognize that we need poetry. We need all the things that Zoe was talking about, that in terms of what literature can do. But also the story about the fascist you were telling, Zoe, I think I read about, I can't remember the woman's name now, but this great book by John Savage called Teenage, which is about all these teenage cultures. And we actually have a question about youth culture that's up. So I was wondering if we could, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. This is from Victoria, who's been with us, I think, from day one. So I'm so pleased that she's here. And I think her question is that she'd like to unpick how we bring this into youth culture, as in making it a process that is developed from early childhood, primary years, and so on. And I think so. That's about engaging with stories. I think it's also about picking up on some of the stuff Jemima was saying about EGTooth. It's about actually doing the work to cope with stories and to understand what are the right stories. We've got an education system that is based on can you reproduce a set answer to a story? Can you put a semicolon in, regardless of whether when we've got that kind of testing, we're not encouraging students to not know the answer, go and explore something. I guess. If you've got any thoughts on how do we connect this discussion with stuff that's happening in schools?
Yeah, it does come down to education in the end, doesn't it, and money, because if the education system we've got isn't going to be funded to do those things, then it's only going to be affordable outside of mainstream schools, in private schools, or through paying for extracurricular activities, and you've got to have money to do that. So you're basically dividing society, and there will be wealthier people who can still afford to encourage their kids to think and explore ideas, and other people are going to struggle. So I think somehow we have to change the education system, and that's just going to take immense amounts of pressure, I think, from nursery, primary up.
And it can feel like we're going, I mean, it's not disconnected in my mind that we're in a moment of really challenging and powerful intellectual discussions around identities, around power, around praxis. What do we do about the stuff we think? At a time when it feels like education is under threat, it feels like access to higher education is under threat, it feels like it's harder and harder for different sorts of students to come to university. I'm pretty sure I probably would find it much harder to come to university as a teenage single mum now than I did in the 80s. I think a lot of the structures that were in place that facilitated my access to university are no longer in place. It feels like there's a relationship there between the institutions and the idea
that there's some kind of war on against people not teaching, but exchanging ideas about critical thinking, about reading in its kind of broadest sense. That's what we need people to do, and they're trying to take the money away from the humanities to make sure that people aren't doing that. It feels very scary in some ways. But
if the view of education is that we're testing that people have learnt the right answer, then I guess that goes hand in hand with the idea that if I spout out my radical views, all of my students are going to somehow passively soak that up and believe me. There's something, a real misunderstanding of what education is in this process, isn't there?
There's a worry about on one hand, we want to educate, but on the other hand, we want to hold people back. There's that tension, I think, at the moment. You can't sort of encourage thinking and then try and dumb it down at the same time. You've got to let people run with it and not be afraid of that.
Yeah, and there's something really utopian about putting art out into the world. It's like saying, this song is not in the world and it needs to be. This story is not being told and it needs to be heard. So if you're thinking about a revolution as like, how does literature relate to that? It's partly about saying, we've got to both open up the stories, make sure the stories from the past are heard, but also we can create a different world. We can write a poem. We can tell a story in a different way.
Absolutely. And I think often, and we're going to close up in a sec, but I think often thinking about doing stuff in the wrong place is the really powerful thing. So Zoe's point on graffiti I think is really important. If I think about Sussex in the Keep, which is our kind of archive and repository, there's an amazing set of photographs from Paris, May 68, where some Sussex students went over and they I think it was one, and they just documented the graffiti and the use of complex situationist philosophy with a spray can or with a stencil. And I think I guess that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to have these conversations in the places where we're not meant to have them and in ways that we're not meant to have them, and sort of slip through the cracks a little bit, I guess.
I was just thinking about Banksy actually, and the fact that writing ended up on the side of a rescue boat. There are all sorts of ways of writing stories, aren't there? And that was a very clever, public, very graphic, graffiti style bit of writing to highlight a situation.
That's a really lovely example. Yeah, that's a great one to kind of close that discussion down with. So have we got any more questions? Have you ever dumped anyone because of the books they like? No one has picked up on that. I think it's a profound question.
I haven't dumped anyone, but I didn't see them again. Because and it wasn't that I hated the books that they had, but I just showed that it lacked personality. I remember just looking at his bookshelf and it was just filled with like architecture and design books. I love architecture and design, but that was it. There was nothing else. And I just thought, I was like, this isn't gonna work out.
I've done people for sort of performative bookshelving. So if there's a lot of capacity, I would go.
Generic is the worst, right? You don't want just, it could, like, they're trying to show off a bookshelf that won't offend anyone or interest anyone, or, you know, it's like you, whatever, at least you can argue with them and say, really, Ayn Rand, you know, do you really want to be reading this?
Is it the Zoom bookshelf that just has to be in the background now? It's nice and unoffensive. I did once manage to dump somebody that I didn't even know, in the sense that I was reading a what to some would be a very controversial and upsetting book when I was a very young teenager, and I didn't really know what I was reading, which was The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski, which is obviously very triggering for a lot of people. And a man shouted at me in a laundrette in Jewish Quarter in Antwerp, and I very much unfriended him for reading it. But I didn't understand what he was saying, but I think it was pretty bad.
Yeah,
so it was a powerful moment.
We should do, the next thing we should do, because we're going to finish off now, is think about where we can read books to start revolutions.
So we've got one more question there.
I think we're going to have to we've hit the 12:30, so we're going to have to go, and we're going to find ways to pick this up in other places. Look at the other events in the series. I think Vivienne's going to have a film for us on the Saturday event, which is around punk women and their stories. So for now, thank you, Jemima, Zoe and Pam. It's been a blast. I hope the audience could understand what we're saying and enjoyed it, and we'll see you all at the next one. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.